Hello. Welcome to the Rhetoric Central stream. There we go. I didn't want it to show you behind the curtain too much there. I thought I had been broadcasting, so I've been talking for quite a while. I am not on my usual computer where I've decided to do this. And as you can see, I have no camera, which is not important because we are reading a piece. Tonight we are reading a piece by John Berger called The Nature of Mass Demonstrations. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about who Berger was before we jump into that, into the piece. Just make sure that it's showing the right thing. Yeah, it is. Great. It is showing the right thing. So John Berger is someone his writing really is very important to me a great deal. I mean, I haven't explored all of his writing, and I kind of intend to. It's one of my goals for the next year or two is to read everything he's written. But he's probably most famous for a piece made for the BBC called Ways of Seeing. It's a documentary series. It's not really even a documentary series. It's kind of like a video essay, but a much better one than what is usually goes under that name on YouTube today. So if you are an aspiring video essayist, watch Ways of Seeing. It'll teach you a better way of seeing. So Berger was an artist and a writer. He wrote many novels. He was awarded the Booker Prize, as it says here, which is probably the most prestigious prize for an English language novel that you can get. It's usually awarded to British authors, occasionally some other nationalities, but it's usually to the British. He also wrote about all sorts of topics that maybe aren't obvious if you're looking at this list of he's an art critic, he's a painter, he's a poet, because Berger was a deeply committed political thinker as well. And sometimes he was described as a Marxist, and inevitably when this would come up in an interview, and the interviewer would say, is it true? Are you still a Marxist? Berger would say, it depends on what you mean by that. And he was kind of a Marxist, but he was within a humanist tradition that was informed by Marxism, I would say. And seeing that, I think what that means for Berger, among many other things, is that we are not primarily individuals, that we have to understand our life in light of society and history. And this led him to write a great deal about lots of different subjects. And so in this short piece that we're reading, The Nature of Mass Demonstrations, he's trying to think about what, and by demonstration here, we might say in American English, we tend to say something more like protest. We'll say demonstration sometimes. But demonstration might be the better term here for kind of what he's talking about, because it may not always be a protest in the way that maybe mass demonstrations today take on the form of a protest as a response to a specific event or a specific policy. It doesn't have to be that. It's really the kind of phenomenon of people being out in the streets. What does that mean? What's going on with a mass demonstration? So this is what his piece is about. 73 years ago, on 6th May 1898, there was a massive demonstration of workers, men and women, in the center of Milan. The events which led up to it involved too long a history to treat with here. The demonstration was attacked and broken up by the army under the command of General Berger. At noon, the cavalry charged the crowd. The unarmed workers tried to make barricades. Martial law was declared, and for 3 days the army fought against the unarmed. The official casualty figures were 100 workers killed and 450 wounded. One policeman was killed accidentally by a soldier. There were no army casualties. 2 years later, Umberto I was assassinated because after the massacre he publicly congratulated General Berger, the butcher of Milan. I've been trying to understand certain aspects of the demonstration in the Corso Venezia on 6 May because of a story I'm writing. So here he's talking about a fictional story, but that might, hopefully my introduction may suggest to you that Berger's fiction was informed by thinking not just, I wasn't just daydreaming. Not that there's anything wrong with daydreaming, but in the process I came to a few conclusions about demonstrations, which may perhaps be more widely applicable. Mass demonstrations should be distinguished from riots or revolutionary uprisings, although under certain now rare circumstances, they may develop into either of the latter. The aims of a riot are usually immediate, the immediacy matching the desperation they express. The seizing of food, the release of prisoners, the destruction of property. The aims of a revolutionary uprising are long-term and comprehensive. They culminate in the taking over of state power. The aims of a demonstration, however, are symbolic. It demonstrates a force that is scarcely used. So he's setting up these three terms: riots, uprisings, demonstrations. The riot, I mean, I think we've all seen riots in our recent memory. And so his way of thinking about it is through the aims. What is the purpose of a riot? I think sometimes the way that riots get mediated is that they don't really have any aims at all. They're just kind of pure chaos. And there's a dark side in representing things that way. But here I think he by contrasting it with revolutionary uprisings, we see that the aims of a riot, that there is a kind of collectivity that can be said to have a purpose, but it's just a very immediate purpose. So that would include something like perhaps the storming of the Bastille. That's part of the French Revolution. So something that might be a riot could eventually transform into something like a revolutionary uprising. So immediate aim doesn't necessarily preclude it from being meaningful. So that's one thing I think he's talking about. The revolutionary uprising, long-term and comprehensive, they culminate in taking over state power. When he says long-term, I don't think it means that every time there is a revolutionary uprising, it's always successful. It's that its aims are concerning the future, not just the immediate present. So the demonstration here is different from both of these. Its purposes, its desires, its aims are symbolic. So let's see what he means by that. It demonstrates a force that is scarcely used. A large number of people assembled together in an obvious and already announced public place. They are more or less unarmed, Why does he say more or less unarmed? He puts in parentheses here, the 6th May 1898, they were entirely unarmed. But sometimes I was recently looking at something about the 1968 protests, or actually a little bit later, the protests that led to the Kent State shooting. And as it was being reported, students were throwing stones, things like that. So there might be a certain kind of arming, but it's not a militant force of people who are kind of ready to use arms in order to achieve their aims. So they're more or less unarmed. They present themselves as a target to the forces of repression serving the state authority against whose policies they are protesting. I mean, I think that's often unstated. If you go to a demonstration, if you go to a protest, people probably won't say this. We're like, we need to be a target. People will talk about, if they talk about anything about state force, they'll say we need to protect each other. Let's link arms. Here are the strategies. Here are where the medics are. This kind of will be common talk. And I don't think that contradicts the idea that you're being presented as a target. It's actually confirmation of it, saying, so inside of this movement, we want to be safe. We want to protect each other. But we are presenting ourselves as being vulnerable against the state authority. Why is it the state authority? Is it always because the state authority is what's being protested? Not necessarily. But the state authority will arrive if there is a mass demonstration. This is kind of part of the tactics of demonstration. The police will show up. Theoretically, demonstrations are meant to reveal the strength of popular opinion or feeling. Theoretically, they are an appeal to the democratic conscience of the state. But this presupposes a conscience which is very unlikely to exist. So we could read this as his cynicism, but I don't think that's quite right. And we'll see that a little bit further on what he's going to do with this. But I think it's important that there's a kind of, what he's saying, this theoretical level of the demonstration to what he's going to say is maybe the real point of the demonstration at the symbolic level. So if the kind of, let's say, liberal theory of demonstration is we're going to go out to the streets and make a demand, You would imagine that there would have to be someone there to hear your demand, who's in power, who would do it. But that doesn't seem very likely, because often the people that you're protesting are the very ones in power. So you could imagine protests in Russia against Putin by the opposition parties. Well, I mean, there's not even really a opposition party by the opposition. Alexander Navalny, who died recently. Whatever you think of that movement, it takes a lot of courage to be able to assemble under that kind of threat. Did they really think that Putin was going to be like, you know what? Now that they've all come out, I gotta take a second chance. So no, I mean, so then why even bother? What's going on? That's kind of the question here. Why make that gesture of appeal to a conscience if you really don't think it's ever going to be answered? What's the point of doing this? If the state authority is open to democratic influence, the demonstration will hardly be necessary. So if there really was a leader like that, you wouldn't march in the streets. You might maybe write a letter or something, you would do it in a different way. If it is not, it is unlikely to be influenced by an empty show of force containing no real threat. A demonstration in support of an already established alternative state authority, as when Garibaldi entered Naples in 1860, is a special case and may be immediately effective. I think that's maybe a difficult example to imagine, but another Italian one that might also come to mind, and maybe not be the most happy example, but Mussolini's this is a highly artificial example, his march on Rome. But the capitulation of the Italian state at the time to the fascists came about during this, I think you can call it a demonstration. It's an unusual demonstration in many ways. It was a mass fascist demonstration. So it was a fascist articulation of what the mass meant, of what the masses looked like. It assembled as if it were a military parade. Okay, but that's why Berger is saying that these are kind of special cases. There really isn't any threat most of the time to the state power when the people assemble en masse. Demonstrations took place before the principle of democracy was even nominally admitted. The massive early Chartist demonstrations were part of the struggle to obtain such an admission. So Chartism was a movement in the 19th century, largely in England, but an important historical movement where huge crowds of workers, the movement was not just the demonstration, but huge crowds of workers would meet and demanding, it was called Chartism because of the founding document of the movement, or what it rallied around was this kind of charter of the people, certain rights and certain changes that the Chartists wished to bring about. Often it was class-based. It was about working people largely. The crowds who gathered to present their petition to the Tsar in St. Petersburg in 1905 were appealing and presenting themselves as a target to the ruthless power of an absolute monarchy. So this is the Russian Revolution, but not maybe the one you're thinking of, which is the 1917 revolution. There's a series of revolutions even within 1917. This is the earlier one, the 1905 one, which led to something called Bloody Sunday, and this is what he's about to refer to. In the event, as on so many hundreds of other occasions all over Europe, they were shot down. So this massive protest against the Tsar in 1905 led to massive killings and shootings. Of course, there are many examples of this in our contemporary moment that are still ongoing. The Syrian revolution, or uprising, or protest movement, whatever you want to call it, it's hard to talk about it now, was led to massive shootings by the state, live rounds right into the people that were gathered, that eventually spiraled out into the Syrian civil war, which in some ways it continues today. There are many other tragic examples that we could offer. I guess one of the reasons why maybe he cites 1905, again, he is a Marxist or thinking in the Marxist tradition, so 1917 for him is not a sad story. Whatever else happened afterwards, the Russian Revolution was a great moment of possibility in history. That 1905 kind of prepares the way for that. So this profound violence enacted by the Tsarist state against the people in St. Petersburg eventually becomes effective, but many years later in 1917. It would seem that the true function of demonstrations is not to convince the existing state authority to any significant degree. Such an aim is only a convenient rationalization. The truth is that mass demonstrations are rehearsals for revolution. Not strategic or even tactical ones, but rehearsals of revolutionary awareness. The delays between the rehearsals and the real performance may be very long. Their quality, the intensity of rehearsed awareness, may on different occasions vary considerably, but any demonstration which lacks this element of rehearsal is better described as an officially encouraged public spectacle. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to call out any particular protest movements right now, but I feel like I've been at a few demonstrations or have been kind of around ones that felt like they didn't really challenge power, but maybe were kind of orchestrated alongside or with power. I was at one protest, not my favorite, called the March for Science. Maybe some of you old heads out there will remember this. The March for Science, a very weird kind of protest, which was a protest, not really clear what it was for or what it sought to accomplish. And at the one that I was at, because it happened in different cities around the country, the mayor was there, and the mayor was like, "I support the," but he was like a planned event and stuff. So it's like, okay, well, what aspect of science is under attack, and who needs support? It was kind of a confusing one. So that might be an example of one of those. I guess I did call out that. That wasn't the one I was first thinking of. That seems safer because I don't think there's anybody who's still part of a movement called the March for Science that died a pretty fast death. A demonstration, however much spontaneity it may contain, is a created event which arbitrarily separates it from ordinary life. Its value is the result of its artificiality, for therein lie its prophetic, rehearsing possibilities. A mass demonstration distinguishes itself from other mass crowds because it congregates in public to create its function, instead of forming in response to one. In this it differs from any assembly of workers within their place of work, even when strike action is involved, or from any crowd of spectators. It is an assembly which challenges what is given by the mere fact of its coming together. So I think one thing to remind ourselves of is, for him, a mass demonstration, the word mass there isn't just, whoa, it's really big. Many political thinkers, there's a tradition of political thought that would distinguish the mass from other kinds of groupings, we might say, like social groups or classes or crowds. That the mass is, you could think about the mass as, not in the moment of demonstration, as a kind of media representation of the population grouped together as a political whole. The masses. So when there's a demonstration that's a mass demonstration, it may in part be thought of as a mass demonstration, not just because of its size, but because of the admixture of all different types of groups that otherwise would not be able to be represented as a body. So when workers go on strike, for him, that's not a mass demonstration, even if, that's not what he's thinking of right here, even if, like, right now, the Samsung workers in the Republic of Korea went on strike, and there's a huge number of them, thousands, are going on strike at the same time, and they're assembling together in public. So in a certain sense, it could be a mass demonstration, but because they already have a purpose, it's not what he's talking about here the same. That the mass demonstration gets together to create its own function. It's a new body to be formed, kind of about to be formed. State authorities usually lie about the number of demonstrators involved. The lie, however, makes little difference. It would only make a significant difference if demonstrations really were an appeal to the democratic conscience of the state. I think it's hard right now, given that we're in this American presidential election cycle, not to think about lying about numbers and not to think about Donald Trump's. At one point, this is a major media focus, which was odd to focus on it, but okay, where they kept focusing on Trump lying about his crowd size. Lots of stupid jokes were made about this. But Trump was tapping into something that the media often also uses, which is crowd size, or the size of a demonstration, somehow reflects something about public opinion. Anyway, the importance of the numbers involved is to be found in the direct experience of those taking part or in sympathetically witnessing the demonstration. For them, the numbers cease to be numbers and become evidence of their senses, the conclusions of their imagination. You're looking around, you see all these people. You're like, oh my gosh, I know that person. And look at all these people I don't know. What am I a part of here? I'm part of this. The larger the demonstration, the more powerful and immediate, visible, audible, tangible, a metaphor it becomes for their total collective strength. So you're there, you're in a real demonstration, but the power of the demonstration is actually metaphorical. It's a real metaphor. The metaphor of, hey, us, we're all together in something. We have some kind of strength. We have some kind of power. I say metaphor because the strength thus grasped transcends the potential strength of those present. And certainly their actual strength is deployed in a demonstration. I mean, what are we going to do? We're going to walk around the city and then go home. So it's not, the actual power isn't really what the metaphor is about. The more people are there, the more forcibly they represent to each other and to themselves those who are absent. In this way, a mass demonstration simultaneously extends and gives body to an abstraction. Those who take part become more positively aware of how they belong to a class. Belonging to that class ceases to imply a common fate and implies a common opportunity. That's such a good line. Belonging to that class ceases to become a common fate, implies a common opportunity. What could we all do? We're all here now. And there's a different kind of relationship to time. So there's a lot of song, maybe if you're like me, you might like Bruce Springsteen. A lot of Bruce Springsteen's music imagines a character. They're different characters. They're usually, especially in his very popular music, young American men of the working class who are kind of fed up with their one-horse town and are looking for something else. Oftentimes, the freedom they imagine is something like getting on the road or running away with a lover, something like that. The fascination with kind of one's individual life, that the promise of happiness is in one's individual life, is that kind of very familiar class longing that I would say many working class people have in different cultural forms. But what if we would see the actual thing that feels like your fate, working all day in my daddy's garage, that in the mass demonstration, this is part of belonging to historical opportunity. So this is what he's trying to point out to us, this inflection point that people experience and feel at demonstrations. They begin to recognize that the function of their class need no longer be limited, that it too, like the demonstration itself, can create its own function. Revolutionary awareness is rehearsed in another way by the choice and effect of location. Demonstrations are essentially urban in character, and they are usually planned to take place as near as possible to some symbolic center, either civic or national. So Tahrir Square in Egypt. Almost every demonstration that's happened in the 20th century, that's like a very big, important one in Cairo, happens in Tahrir Square. The March on Washington. Let's take it right to the center of power, symbolic power, etc., etc. Makes sense. Their targets are seldom the strategic ones: railway stations, barracks, radio stations, airports. A mass demonstration can be interpreted as the symbolic capturing of a city or capital. Again, the symbolism or metaphor is for the benefit of the participants. So one of the frequent chants in modern demonstrations, there are different chants in different languages, and there's different kind of protest traditions in different cultures. But in the American protest tradition, the chant of "this is what democracy sounds like." So that being kind of heard and filmed is a symbol of saying we are the ones that make up the voice of democracy. Even if we're not usually being heard, and even if usually the media is kind of covering what the politicians are saying, we're the ones. It's what we say. That's democracy. Well, and we might not say anything other than the chant right now, but it's a kind of interpretive claim, a symbolic claim to that city, that space, that country. The demonstration, an irregular event created by the demonstrators, nevertheless takes place near the city center, intended for very different uses. The demonstrators interrupt the regular life of the streets they march through or of the open spaces they fill. They cut off these areas, and not yet having the power to occupy them permanently, they transform them into a temporary stage on which they dramatize the power they still lack. The demonstrators' view of the city surrounding their stage also changes. By demonstrating, they manifest a greater freedom and independence, greater creativity, even although the product is only symbolic. than they ever can achieve individually or collectively when pursuing their regular lives. In their regular pursuits, they only modify circumstances. By demonstrating, they symbolically oppose their very existence to circumstances. Now, there's a way in which this is, I think you could read it as a very romantic interpretation of a mass demonstration. That they manifest a greater freedom and independence when you demonstrate. It might not feel that way. Again, if you are familiar with contemporary demonstrations, they can feel highly rehearsed. They feel, he claims that they're artificial, but in this sense, artificial in a way that they feel almost pro forma, like doing another one, we're doing another one. So it's hard to imagine what kind of creativity he might be imagining here. But I think there are certain contemporary protest movements that have tried to capture some of that sense of creativity. The occupation as a modern protest tactic. And like, well, what did people do when they are trying to kill time, when they're occupying a building or occupying a public square or space? A lot of times they engage in various kinds of new creative ways of interacting with other people. You can kind of stop by the occupation and someone will be doing a drawing class or things like that. But it's also just the creativity of coming up with a purpose. That itself is a creative act. It doesn't have to be part of the fine arts, though it can be too. This creativity may be desperate in origins, and the price to be paid for it high, but it temporarily changes their outlook. They become corporately aware, and he doesn't mean like corporations. He means like as a collective body. You come together as one. Corporately aware that it is they or those whom they represent who have built the city and who maintain it. They see it through different eyes. They see it as their product, confirming their potential instead of reducing it. So if you often look at, maybe you live in a town or a city and you kind of look around and you might see all this kind of gray concrete or iron and glass and steel and feel kind of out of place there. Maybe you go back to not great housing where you live and you rent and it feels kind of arbitrary and you don't really feel like you belong there. All these kinds of feelings might be what it feels like alone. But together, you're with everybody. You're in the streets. You feel like this is our city. You see it differently. Who does this belong to? Whose streets are our streets? This is one of the cries of the mass demonstration today. Finally, there is another way in which revolutionary awareness is rehearsed. The demonstrators present themselves as a target to the so-called forces of law and order. Yet the larger the target they present, the stronger they feel. This cannot be explained by the banal principle of strength in numbers, any more than by vulgar theories of crowd psychology. So it's not just that you could say, oh, well, you can't take us all. I mean, which is sometimes true, though it's becoming less true with new forms of surveillance. But there's something else that he wants to talk about. The contradiction between their actual vulnerability and their sense of invincibility corresponds to the dilemma which they force upon the state authority. Either authority must abdicate and allow the crowd to do as it wishes, in which case the symbolic suddenly becomes real. The symbolic here being the mass demonstrators' claim to be an alternate form of power. So if they're like, okay, I guess so, it's like, oh gosh, here we are. And that's happened a few times in recent memory. Part of what is really horribly called the Arab Spring. There were a few moments where there was a kind of abdication to the crowd, to the people that were assembled. So, and even if the crowd's lack of organization and preparedness prevents it from consolidating its victory, the event demonstrates the weakness of authority. Or else authority must constrain and disperse the crowd with violence, in which case the undemocratic character of such authority is publicly displayed. The imposed dilemma is between displayed weakness and displayed authoritarianism. The officially approved and controlled demonstration does not impose the same dilemma. Its symbolism is censored, which is why I term it a mere spectacle. Almost invariably, authority chooses to use force. The extent of its violence depends upon many factors, but scarcely ever upon the scale of the physical threat offered by the demonstrators. This threat is essentially symbolic. But by attacking the demonstration, authority ensures that the symbolic event becomes an historical one, an event to be remembered, to be learnt from, to be avenged. One thing that I think is maybe kind of telling. I don't think this would be the case when Berger was writing, but a pretty common feature of demonstrations today is that part of the police presence, this has to be in a kind of, city that can afford this, but part of the police presence is police presence by helicopter. Well, what's a helicopter really going to do? Obviously, there have been really horrific events where people have been shot down from the air in some parts of the world. But most of the time, this is not what's happening. What did the helicopters really propose to do? I think what they propose to do is to say, kind of symbolic, it's a symbolic answer to the protest. We're above you, we're in control, we're surveilling everything, we can see it. Even if that doesn't really have a practical effect on the demonstration of that evening or week or whatever long it's going to last. But what he's trying to say here is that if there is violence that's used, this makes the demonstration significant. It changes its place in time so that it's kind of a metaphor into an event. As he says, to be remembered, to be learned from, to be avenged. It is in the nature of a demonstration to provoke violence upon itself. Its provocation may also be violent, but in the end it is bound to suffer more than it inflicts. This is a tactical truth and a historical one. So it's what you have to understand is going to happen, and also historically what has happened. The historical role of demonstrations is to show the injustice, cruelty, irrationality of the existing state authority. Demonstrations are protests of innocence. But the innocence is of two kinds, which can only be treated as though they are at one symbolic level. For the purposes of political analysis and the planning of revolutionary action, they must be separated. There is an innocence to be defended and an innocence which must finally be lost. An innocence which derives from justice and an innocence which is the consequence of a lack of experience. It's a really interesting distinction. So you can be like, oh, I'm an innocent ingenue. I don't really know what's going on. This might be the way that a lot of people, I think, lead their political lives. They're like, I just don't really, politics is so upsetting. I don't really know what's going on with politics. This has become kind of acceptable. I wonder if in like a truly democratic society, whether this wouldn't be a source of shame. One of the etymologies that I like is that the word idiot, which today seems to refer to intelligence, the history of that is kind of interesting. But it originally comes from a word in Greek, which would mean a private person. A person, the idiotes, the person who wanted to live by themselves, was seen as with derision. What are you on about? What's he building in there? What's going on with that guy? Why is he like that? Why isn't he part of the political life where we live? So I wonder whether today maybe this kind of embarrassed, feigned sort of innocence of someone who's like, I don't really have any experience with politics, I don't know anything about that, is maybe a sign that we don't have a very robust democracy. But the other innocence is the innocence that derives from justice. So we sometimes combine these together when we talk about innocence, and he wants to separate them apart. We have to kind of gain experience, and so lose the innocence, the cheap form of innocence. Demonstrations express political ambitions before the political means necessary to realize them have been created. Demonstrations predict the realization of their own ambitions and thus may contribute to that realization, but they cannot themselves achieve them. So people will sometimes say things in demonstration slogans like, history is watching. We don't have the power, but we're here prophetically telling you that in some time to come, this power or this form of power is going to, it's going to get its comeuppance, it's going to fall, it's to be destroyed, it'll be replaced. The question which revolutionaries must decide in any given historical situation is whether or not further symbolic rehearsals are necessary. The next stage is training in tactics and strategy for the performance itself. There you go, 1968. Very much of a piece of the kind of revolutionary fervor, rage, but also, I would say, optimism of this time. Just a few kind of closing thoughts on this piece, which I think for me has a greater effect, partly because I am familiar with his other work, and one of the qualities of his writing and his speech and of his public life of John Berger is this great gentleness. He's a very gentle, not a gentleman, but a gentle man. The way he spoke, kind of softly, he was very thoughtful. And if you read this piece without kind of seeing that character, you might get the sense that this is someone who's very interested in violence and trying to kind of get us to a greater explosion of violence. I think instead, though, is that there's this kind of gentleness of his thinking of saying, well, what's going on in a mass demonstration? If we looked at it without kind of greater thinking, we might lose the ability to be gentle towards it. We might look at mass demonstrations and say, well, they make these demands and they always fail. So what a pointless, stupid act. Or we could take the kind of threat of the mass demonstration too seriously, ourselves being naive, and say something like, oh my gosh, these people they want to riot, they're out of control, we need to kind of go back to order. But to see the nature of mass demonstrations the way Berger does, as a kind of rehearsal for something else, so that the possibility of whether it has succeeded or failed is indefinite. It kind of depends on the performance. I think is a very kind of gentle, careful, but also very clever way of thinking about what a mass demonstration is and what it might be. So that we could only ever, if you were in a play and you were at rehearsals, someone's like, well, how was rehearsal? And you come back from the rehearsal and say, oh, well, it was this way or that way. And people always say, well, just wait till the opening night. Everything will be different. And maybe it will be. It's hard to say how well your rehearsals are going before you actually perform. Or if you're a musician, you're kind of rehearsing for some concert. Your rehearsals will be determined, their value will be determined by the performance. If mass demonstrations are rehearsals, then we don't know whether they're valuable or not until we get to the performance. That's a different moment. Why is this relevant to thinking about controversy? So if you're coming to this and you're in my class on public communication and controversy, partly we're looking at this historical moment of 1968 especially, but the broader context of the Vietnam War. And mass demonstration is a major form of public controversy. And I think if we wanted to study it the way it is often studied, either in the tradition of rhetoric as social movements, then we think of it as a social movement primarily. I think we maybe miss something about mass demonstration in terms of its symbolic power. The social movement theories, of course, they attend to things like symbolic power, many of them do, but the social movement theory really wants to see the mass demonstration as a force of social change. So there's an idea within social movement theory that social change relies upon these movements of the people and demonstration. In some sense, that's a very optimistic point of view of the mass demonstration, I would say, that is not uncritically adopted, but really is there in some kind of basic methodological way. It's part of the original existence of that field to try to amend certain theories of politics or sociology of politics or of political communication with this saying, well, what about what the people are saying? So in the tradition that studies rhetoric in the academy, in the 60s and 70s, the professors were saying, well, I keep talking about these speeches. The students are saying, come listen to mine. How can I teach about rhetoric if I'm just going to teach all of these old presidential speeches? Like, how can I teach about what's happening right now? And that feeling of pressure from the student movement especially actually changed this field in a significant way. Though there are still a lot of people that are studying social movements from the point of view of trying to think about how to control them or end them or manipulate them in certain ways. But the other tradition that I think this kind of inflects about the mass demonstration is not the one that would see it as kind of completely failing because it hasn't achieved its demands, as I was mentioning before, necessarily. That wouldn't be the way that the pessimists would study mass demonstrations, but rather that mass demonstrations are always ideological in the sense that what you are reading off when you look at a mass demonstration is a certain kind of mind control, some effective media. And this is true for people in all aspects of the political spectrum, how you might look at some other mass demonstration. You say, okay, these people are brainwashed. They're loony Marxist professors are telling them about things that don't make any sense. Or you could say, oh, these people, they went down a QAnon rabbit hole and they're just kind of they believing in these absurd talking points, these conspiracy theories. And there's a possibility, I think, that those critiques are right in some way. They see something potentially about what's going on in a mass demonstration. But one thing that they might miss is that things change. How people understand themselves changes in the mass demonstration itself. The people start to see opportunities and possibilities they didn't see before. And that could go for better or worse. Anyway, this has been an interesting reading, I think. I hope that you've enjoyed it and gotten something from it. And I'd recommend that you should read more John Berger if you liked this piece. This is not even close to his best essay. He's got some really, really great stuff. All right, well, until next time. Bye.